Hi everybody, this is Lucas with Custom Firearm Solutions. Today we have a Savage Model 330 that a customer brought in. Today we're going to show you how to disassemble and reassemble this shotgun. It's a little bit tricky if you're not familiar with how to get that trigger in there again. Customer brought it in though, the barrels aren't resetting quite right, and we're going to diagnose why that is as well. But for the most part, this will be a quick informative video for you, how to disassemble and reassemble this shotgun. To start with, just like any other gun, you want to break open your action here and make sure that your chamber is empty and it's safe to disassemble. From there, this gun is very, very simple. You have your handguard here, which takes off your barrel, and you only have a couple screws on the bottom here, which takes off your buttstock. And then you have a couple screws on the bottom here that loosens up your trigger plate. To take this guy off, first of all, we're going to start by removing the front foregrip. And then if we break this open, you'll be able to remove your barrel. It just slides out. You'll notice when you take this out, on the inside, you have a little lever, you have a little bracket, if you will, that your barrel slides into. Take note of how this bracket is sitting on the bottom of your receiver here, because it does have to line back up in that same way to put it back in. Next, we're going to take out the two screws on the bottom of our trigger plate. Just uses a small little flathead screwdriver. And then lastly, we have our two screws on the top here of the rear tang. Take those guys out as well. All right, so now for the tricky part of this guy. Everything's kind of loose and it will fall apart on you. But take note as to how this slides apart before you put it back together. That's where it gets a little tricky. I'd grab the bottom of your trigger and pop that down. And your wood stock is going to slide out at the same time as your trigger plate's going to try to fall out on you. Just be careful when you're doing that you don't drop your stock. You don't want to crack your wood. From there, your trigger plate will just slide out of the bottom, and the trigger guard will simply unscrew from the trigger plate. From this point, for the most part, you're fully disassembled for your basic cleaning and things of that nature there. Do keep in mind when you pull this out, I mentioned how your barrel rides in this little groove here, this little arm. If you let go of the bottom, this little lever is loose and it can slide out on you. And if it slides out when you're cleaning, that's when it can get a little difficult to try to get back together just right. Stay tuned for the end of the video and we'll show you how to reassemble. But for now, we're going to dive into why this trigger is not resetting when they break open the action. So I did a little bit of inspecting on this here, and what's happening is when the triggers are fired, two things are going on. The barrel selector on the bottom is very, very stiff, and it really doesn't want to move all the time. Secondly, when I do get it to cock like this, sometimes each individual barrel will fire, and sometimes both barrels will fire. And sometimes, like right now, I can't get the other barrel to fire. Something on the inside here is all gummed up. After a quick inspection, nothing's out of the ordinary. They have holes on the side here where you can see the sears catching on the hammers. They're not rounded off. Nothing's weird out of the ordinary there. But there's definitely something stuck on the inside that we need to take a look at. Now the first thing, I have a hammer that's stuck cocked back and I can't get it to release no matter what I do. I want to be very, very careful with this. I can't seem to move my barrel selector. The trigger doesn't want to move. There is a little safety lever in the back that falls down, this little guy here. We want to make sure that that's in the right position for this trigger to move. And now I got that barrel, or now I got that hammer to advance. I want to take this apart, but these main springs on the back are very, very difficult to reinstall if I can get these things out of here. So I'm going to try to take out the trigger without removing the hammers or the mainsprings. Once I get those out, I can take a closer look and I can see what's going on in there. I'm hoping things are just gummed up and nothing's moving quite freely, easily. But we'll see if we have any warm parts while we're in there. All right, so to start disassembling our trigger assembly here, we need to make sure our hammers are released. If there's any spring tension on there, you're going to have a heck of a time. This main pin right here will take out our hammers. It is just a very light press in. You might need a punch to get it started. And once that pin's out, our hammers will slide out. Now, these hammers are the exact same on both sides. They could go in either way, but I like to just set them aside so I know how they came out, so I can reinstall them in the same direction. From there, I'm going to take apart our trigger. Our trigger is going to be this little pin on the bottom here. And with a little punch, we'll just slide that guy out. Now, when we slide this out, there's going to be a lot of little parts that are going to want to fall out, so just be careful when you do this. All right, and then carefully remove your trigger and take a look at how this all goes together. So if you take a look, you have a small rounded spring here. That's your detent spring. You have a little lever assembly here. That's your barrel selection lever. Take note of how that came out of there. And then lastly, you have your barrel selector button and a little bitty spring on the inside here. The problem that we had with this shotgun was this spring here was too loose and it was worn out, and it wasn't properly detenting and indexing where our barrel selector lever was. With that happening, sometimes it would be in a position where it'd be in the middle and both barrels would fire. Sometimes it wouldn't move left to right, wouldn't be able to catch properly, causing a whole bunch of issues there. So we adjusted this spring, just gave it a little tweak, and I'll show you how to put it all back together now. So when you go to put this together, you have 5 pieces. You have your trigger housing, you have this little coil spring, you have your selector lever, you have your selector mechanism, and you have this little spring, leaf spring. So first thing you want to do is slide your selector lever into the housing. Get it through both sides. And just keep it balanced in there so it doesn't slide out. From there, take this very small spring. You're going to put it in this little recessed pocket right at the front of the trigger. Next, we'll take our selector mechanism and notice the orientation of it here. It has one long arm in front and a short arm in the back, as well as a little inverted V point on the front. Now, when we go to install this, just keep in mind in the middle of this little V, we're going to have the 2 arms of our sears are going to ride right in the middle of this little V or this little U shape in there. So now when we put it in, we'll just set that in there. And you notice that the long arm is on the front half, as well as that inverted V is facing forward. Now we're going to take our leaf spring, which will note that one end has a hook and one end has a V. The hook of this leaf spring is going to ride right in this little pocket, this little hole on the front of the trigger. Then it's going to lay right in between the groove there, right over top of that coil spring. And then the V of this spring is going to be touching the V of the selector. So now if we were to take a pin, just hold down pressure right down the middle of that spring, we should be able to verify that there is a detent or spring tension on our selector as we push it, which there is. Now from there, we need to make sure everything's still lined up, and we don't want to move this too much or else that spring will fall out of place. And we're going to go ahead and put the spring or the trigger assembly into the trigger plate. Now here we want to take our time. We don't want to rotate it very much or else we'll lose our springs. And you'll notice that the 2 arms on the trigger plate are going to fall right into that groove of the selector lever. Now before I put that pin in, I'm holding pressure on it so it doesn't fall out. I'm going to take a look from up top here, and I want to make sure that those 2 arms are seated in the U of that barrel selector. In this case, they're currently not, so I'm going to take this little punch here. I'm going to move that lever backwards, and it'll snap in place so that those 2 little arms are right in the middle of that U. From there, I'm going to go ahead and push my pin in. It's not a very tight fit, so you should be able to push it in by hand. You might have to just give it a little bit of persuasion with a hammer. And from there, our trigger assembly is installed. Now, it's very easy for that leaf spring to be messed up, so let's make sure everything works like it should. First thing I should note is our selector should have a nice positive detent. And you can hear a good click each way. If that detent was not making a nice click or is a little loose, take it back apart and that leaf spring isn't quite installed properly. Second thing, I need to make sure that, again, the little pawl, if you call it, is right in the middle of that U shape on our barrel selector on the inside here, which visually I can see this side is in place and this side is in place. I want to make sure that it actuates our sears before I go any farther. This here is our safety lever. Our safety lever has to be forward for this to work. So right now, I just select one barrel. I'm going to pull the trigger, and I should note that one of these sears will be moving, and only one, which that is the case. Now if I select the other barrel, and I do the same thing, only one moves, which is the case. From there, I know that the barrel selection is operating as it should. Our last step is to make sure that our safety works. Our safety lever is connected right there. With that safety lever backwards, this trigger should not move. It should not, I shouldn't say it shouldn't move, it should not actuate any of these sears. So I can verify that nothing happens there, and nothing happens there. From there, we're good to reinstall the hammers. So now the hammers, again, they're the same on both sides, but I'm going to put it in the same way that I took it out. You'll just have to put a little bit of pressure with your thumb to get them to line up. You just push them back against those springs a little bit. And they should push in by hand for the most part. Again, you might have to give it a little tap just to get them home. And when you're all said and done, you want to make sure that all of your pins are flush on the outside. You don't want them sticking out at all. From there, I want to push my hammers back manually and make sure that they cock and they stay cocked, which they do. From there, I do not want to pull the trigger anymore. If these hammers fly forward, there's nothing to stop them from overextending. If they overextend, this little barrel selection lever can fall out of place in there and you have to start all over again. So be very careful from here that you do not accidentally pull that trigger. If you do, take a step back, double check, make sure everything is still working properly. If not, take the trigger back out and reassemble. From there, we're ready to install the trigger into the receiver and put the stock back on. Here's where things can get a little bit tricky. Now remember this lever that falls out of the bottom, that has to go back in place, and this groove has to line up in these grooves here. So to do that, this little piece on the bottom gets put backwards. This nub goes forward into place. And now here, where we have to line up that nub with these two arms. Now once we get it all in place, this arm should be vertical, and you'll see that that nub has fallen into that little pocket. From there, we'll install the stock onto the receiver. That'll simply drop in place and slide in. Now here's where things get really tricky. You have your safety lever here. That safety lever needs to properly meet up with this safety lever down here. To get everything to line up, it's very hard to see, so I'm going to do this just as an example without the stock on so you can see what's happening here. What you're going to do, again, be very careful not to touch your trigger. You're going to slide your trigger into the receiver, and now this notch right here, I needed to bring that up so that it falls in place with this pocket right here. If that is not perfectly lined up, it won't go together. The other thing you'll notice is this little silver arm here, how it rides in there, it's loose. So if we're going to install this, and I'm trying to do it maybe sideways, and this thing fell upwards, which is going to be hard to do on camera, and then I try to install it, I'll never be able to get it to fit just quite right. So when I install this, I want to do it so it's pointed downward, so gravity holds this arm down. So once I get everything to line up just the way I want it to, it'll go together real easy. So now let's do that with the stock on. So again, just setting the stock in place. Now it's kind of a trial and error guesswork. I know that safety arm has to be about right there. I'm going to very carefully slide it all together and try to line up that safety arm into that pocket. And if I do it just right, it pops right into place with no problems there. Now you'll notice that the stock is still loose yet here. That's okay. We're going to tighten that down in a certain order. But first, I want to put the trigger guard on. To do that, you simply screw in the front. You have to pick it up so that it doesn't scratch the rear of the wood as you go. Now I'm just going to go until that stops tight, and I'm going to back it off one turn until my holes line up. From there, I first want to put in these two small screws on the bottom, otherwise things will not line up. All right, from there, now we can take up the slack in our stock. Make sure our stock is fully seated, and we'll put our screws in through the top of the stock. Alrighty, and lastly, the barrel's a little tricky on this guy if you're not familiar with it. It's not like other shotguns where you break open and then you take your barrel off. This barrel simply slides in straight from the top. Alright, so to put your barrel back on this one, little different, little tricky. You have this little bracket, if you will, that swings in here. This bracket needs to be pretty much perpendicular at a 90-degree angle. It's not like other shotguns where you got to put your barrel on at a big angle. This one goes on almost straight up and down. So with that bracket perpendicular at a 90, you just slide the barrel almost straight up and down, and it'll slide right onto the receiver. I hold that shut while I take my foregrip and snap that back together. From there, everything is assembled. All right, and now that our gun's fully reassembled, we're going to go ahead and do a functions check. First, we're going to make sure there's nothing in the chambers before we do this. Everything just cocked like it should. This system is set up that when you break it open, it should automatically put the safety on, which it did when we just opened it. So now the safety's on. I should not be able to pull the trigger, which is correct, I cannot. If I take the safety off, put it on fire, again, there's nothing in the chamber. With one trigger, I should fire one barrel. And with another pull, I should fire the other barrel, which is correct. Now I'm going to break that open. It just reset. Again, it put it on safe. I'm going to change it to the other barrels. I'm going to take it off safe. Fires one barrel. Fires the other barrel. Resets and puts it on safe. And I cannot pull the trigger. From there, we know this firearm is good to go. At this point, I'm going to go take it out to the range, take a couple test shots out of it just to make sure it's safe to go. But other than that, that is how you disassemble and reassemble a Savage 330. Just be very careful. It's very finicky on the inside. For whatever reason, something doesn't want to go back together. More than likely, the problem is lying in your barrel selector. If things don't want to operate just right, it's probably in your barrel selector. Got to be very, very careful when you're taking these things apart. They have to be done in a sequence. If they're not reinstalled in that sequence or one thing is out of place, it's not going to work for you. But of course, if you have any problems with that, you can always bring it to me. You can even mail it in and I can fix it for you from there and ship it right back to you. Just look up Custom Firearm Solutions in Crandon, Wisconsin, and I'd be more than happy to give you guys a hand. Other than that, we'll see you for the next video.